What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning The Dr. Vibe Show. As always, I'd like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. Also know I'm a certified empowerment coach, president and CEO of Express Your Vibe Coaching and Communications. I have been waiting for this epic conversation for a long time, for a number of reasons. It's a very important conversation. First of all, let me share the friend who is sharing with us tonight. It's Dr. Tommy Curry. He's professor of philosophy at Texas A&M University. He is a Rothrock Fellow and has commented on social matters in venues ranging from Forbes to Sirius XM. He is the author of over 50 articles on issues of racism, anti-Black violence, and the institutionalization of Black male death. He has just released a very, very important book called The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. Before we get to that, I also want to make you aware he is adamant that the arguments used to justify Black men's death, justify the death and incarceration by Black men, must be challenged. I will also tell you that you need to watch this whether it's live. I want you to do it live because you can give interaction, or on the replay, because of all the people that have been on my YouTube platform. Dr. Curry has been the most watched individual on my YouTube platform, whether by himself or with conversations with other on the Dr. Vibe Show. So we are very blessed and highly favored to have Dr. Tommy J. Curry with us again. How are you, Dr. Curry?
I'm doing well, sir. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am very excited. I'm very much looking forward to this epic conversation. You've been a supporter for a very long time, and I support what you do and will always continue to support what you do. I'm very humbled that you've got time out of your schedule, because in a good way, I had to wait. because you've been so positive productive. I know there was a time, I remember a time going back when I had you on and no one else hardly had you on.
Right.
And it's wonderful to see that I have to wait in line. I don't mind.
Well, I'm humbled. I'm humbled by you giving me an audience in the show. So thank you.
Well, you always have a home here, and you will always have a home here. No worries about this. You know what? Let's get right to it, because if people want to know more about you, they can go in the Dr. Vibe archives. I've had you on a number of times. So let's get right to it. This important book, The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. How long did it take you to write, and why did you write? I know it was always in your spirit to write it, but what sort of process was behind this book?
Well, I wrote chapter 4 was what I was really focused on. And initially, I wasn't going to write a full book on Black males. I just wanted to show that Black men had, in fact, suffered under the violence of rape and, was sexualized during Jim Crow and slavery, and that we need to think differently about how Black men were actually existing in the world. In my field of philosophy, it's very difficult for people to accept that Black males have been victims of something like rape, that they have been sexualized, generally because philosophers don't believe in empirical evidence or historical research. There's an assertion that rape is something specific to the female body. And I wrote Eschatological Dilemmas to challenge that, to show that Black men had not only been victims of rape during slavery, of course, building from some of the work of Thomas Foster, but also that Black men had, even in our present day, been victims of rape by police officers and white vigilantes. So what I was trying to show is that this is part of the structure of racism, or as you know, as other Black male study scholars have shown, this is part of the anti-Black misandry that affects Black males within empires. The book itself came about in a relatively short time, because I just sat down and I was frustrated. I was going up for promotion, and there was this pressure saying, while I had 50, 60 articles, I also needed a book. So I kind of sat down over Christmas break and finished the text. And one of the things that drove me to do it was all the stereotypes that I heard in academic conferences, all the boos and the jeers for me trying to talk about black males. That's what motivated me to try to set the record straight insofar as what black men have actually suffered. And I think that's a really important part because this book is not neutral. There have been people, as I talk about in the epilogue, that didn't want to publish, chapter 4, even though it was already accepted. And I got it published in a different anthology, but there was resistance to publishing Eschatological Dilemmas because they said that it centered black men. I've had, people have asked me to write summaries for the book and then said that they weren't going to publish it after they've already gone through the editorial process because it was about black men and certain people were offended by it. So the idea of speaking positively about black males and challenging some of the theories about black men, both in social sciences and in gender theory under the rubric of intersectionality or black feminism, comes at quite a cost. So when I wrote this book, I was motivated by I knew that would happen, but I was motivated about getting black males right and not defining us just on the basis of sexuality, how close or far we identify with heterosexual black men or as homosexual or transsexual, but to try to understand what the black male body has been represented as, how it's been studied, how it's been distorted and disfigured by the history and legacies of racism. So the book came out. The book was written pretty quickly, actually, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I had to call one of my colleagues and say, "Look, I've written this book."
Hold on, Dr. Curry. You didn't know what to do with it? You were just going to write it and just leave it and being buried with you? Come on, man.
No, seriously. Okay. I was hoping, I didn't want that to happen.
Okay.
But I could not. I couldn't think of a single press to send it to.
Wow.
Because there has been no other book about black men written in this way. Most books about black males start off with the assumption that they're flawed, that throughout history they've been trying to acquire power and dominate others. That's not what I start off with, because I think that version of those, I call it the Cliff Notes version of black feminist historiography is just wrong. And I think that when you look at the history of ethnology in the mid-19th century, you really do see that black males are being sexualized and defined as rapists and being defined as feminine and being defined as less intelligent than their female counterpart. And those things haven't been...
Just interrupt you right there. That doesn't seem to have changed much in today's society.
No, not at all. Not at all. And that's what the book kind of reveals, right? That, some of the first arguments that articulated black men as being dangerous to women or abusers comes about in the debates that white suffragettes are having with people like Frederick Douglass about whether or not black men should get the right to vote. And you have white women testifying, saying, "I've seen black men. I know how tyrannical they are as a class. They abuse their families. They abuse their women. That, this is the arguments, but they're rapists." These are arguments being put forth in 1867. So it's no accident that you see the exact same arguments being rehashed, not only 100 years later, but at the inception of what happens during the civil rights movement that associates black male political power and freedom yet again with hypersexuality and the desire to sleep with white women and the neglect of black women and black families, right, which is articulated in Michelle Wallace's The Black Macho. So what I'm arguing is that these notions that we get from ethnology in the 1850s to white feminism or white suffragism in the 1860s that continue all the way through the early 20th century has really been compiled now in terms of what we think of gender theory, and we haven't questioned it, because it's like a powder keg, right? That if you say feminism or black feminist historiography is incorrect, then you're hit automatically with character attacks. Well, you're saying it's incorrect because you're sexist. You're saying it's incorrect because of your black male privilege. And I'm saying, no, let's just verify the theory. Why are we overlooking all the empirical work that we've had from the 1970s forward showing that black male attitudes on gender and sexism are in line with black women's, if not more progressive in some cases. That black men have always been more gender progressive and egalitarian than white men and white women. See, these are all facts that have been firmly established by the sociological record that have never influenced how we produce theory. And I'm confused by that. Because it's not, I mean, you have to do some searching, but you can find these studies. And these studies have been definitive in the sense that they keep finding the same thing time and time again, no matter when they're done. But they're never part of the conversation about what black men are or what black men actually think. Because we start off with the assumption that black men are misogynist, that black men are sexist, that black men are violent, that black men want to dominate and abuse women. In fact, it's so bad in my fields that when we, and this is just how bad philosophers are at reading social science data, right? Is that, you start off with something like a CDC report or the FBI supplement that says that domestic violence is disproportionate in black communities. And instead of saying, well, why is domestic violence disproportionate in black communities? We say it's because black men are violent. Black men are more hyper-masculine. Black men are more abusive than the general population. And as you see in chapter 3, that's not the case at all. The case is that black people are more impoverished, which is why black men are disproportionately perpetrators of domestic violence and also why they're disproportionately the greatest victims of domestic violence in their communities. So we don't have a very clear picture on how to study and talk about, to articulate the kinds of experiences and disadvantages that black males suffer under, because largely it's been defined by a kind of gender theory, a kind of mythology about black men that's been firmly rooted in racist social science and racist articulations like ethnology since the mid-19th century.
Well, as I said before we went live, I told Dr. Curry we need to do a part 2. I think that's already been solidified already. So definitely, for people who are watching live, and I hope you're watching live, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to watch this epic conversation. If you have any questions or comments on what Dr. Curry is sharing with us, please, I will forward them. Just put them in the chat area and make it happen. Since we started at chapter 4,
yes,
I want to ask, what has been the emotional effect of anti-black male death, rape, and the sexual perception of black males? What has been the effect emotionally from the 1800s, which probably still exists in somewhat today?
Yeah, that's a heavy question. I mean, I'll be honest with you. When I started finding out about this material, it took an emotional toll on me. Because one of the things that I wrote at the same time with a colleague of mine was a study of black boys who had been victims of rape themselves. And I was presenting eschatological dilemmas, at a few different places. And black men would come to me, brown men too, would come to me and tell me that they had been victims of rape. So, I started doing some research because at this point it was largely historical, right? I was more concerned with what happened during slavery and Jim Crow and how this changes the contours of how we understand racism. But then I started having these black males, these men of color approach me, and I didn't know what to do, and they would tell me these stories. So a colleague of mine told me, I went to a conference with her, Dr. Utley, and I said, look, I'm just so frustrated because I've been trying to share the stories and data of young black boys who've been raped or been victims of rape, and no one would listen. They would say that it was insignificant. They would say that it's taking focus away from black women. They said that it was anti-woman. And I said, listen, I just want to talk about the facts. I want to talk about the little bit of data that I've discovered that shows this suffering. So for about 6 months, I was just severely emotionally disturbed by it, because you had all this pain and you had people telling me that this happened to them as a child, or their mother's friend would pay them money to perform oral sex on them, or they didn't know what sex was, so they were being forced to watch other people have sex. Older women would make them watch them having sex. You would hear these stories, and it was so frustrating to me because I felt silenced. Right. That's why the epilogue calls for us to be silent. I felt so silenced in a field that was supposed to be dedicated to inquiring about different and new subjects, but nobody wanted to hear about black males, even young black boys who had been victims of rape and sexual abuse. So, that was draining for me, and I think you can see some of that emotional toll in the book, especially in the later chapters. But overall, discovering this history, and seeing how black men dealt with it, that's why I talk about depression and suicide at the end of the book in in chapter 5, I'm sorry, because nobody asks black men how they deal with the weight of this kind of oppression. And I say that in all seriousness because we're dealing with a situation, we're dealing with a world where homicide and suicide overwhelmingly affect black males in the United States. And there is no academic discussions in any liberal arts field that I know of about these topics. That nobody cares about whether or not black men are oppressed. Black and brown men are the two most underrepresented groups as students and professors in the United States universities. And no one ever talks about their underrepresentation or how climate or departments may improve or retain these groups of people because they're men. In my field, there's not even a conversation specific to recruiting or retaining men of color, despite the numbers, right? Because my field of philosophy is largely anti-empirical. They don't care. The idea of underrepresentation is only talked about in terms of race. And then when it's talked about gender, it's largely talking about white women or women of color. There is no specific space to talk about the underrepresentation of black men, despite the fact that they are outnumbered by their female counterpart. Because we read underrepresentation based on the history of white people, not the specific histories of black and brown folk. So this puts an additional burden on men of color in the academy because they don't even get to claim the fact that they're the most underrepresented and that it's very difficult for them not only to become professors, but to even get through undergrad. Because we've been having this problem, this disparity of the lack and shortage of black and brown men in U.S. academies since the 1970s.
Oh, yeah, huge.
Absolutely. So how do we even formulate the kinds of questions or research questions necessary to address that? We've already arrived at a predetermined answer, which is that no matter how underrepresented black men are, no matter how silenced, no matter what minority they may actually be in classrooms or within the professorate, we say that they're not as disadvantaged as women simply because we have these notions of patriarchy or gender, which says that because they're male, they have advantages. And the book is trying to deal with that contradiction. How do we deal with what black males are going through empirically? And how do we situate that in terms of a theory that could speak not only to their experiences, but reformulate the way that we engage and interact with young men of color, because they're suffering from things that, feminist theory and intersectionality theory has simply never addressed. It has never addressed depression. It has never addressed, issues of sexual abuse or domestic abuse. None of these questions for the last 30 years have been asked by this theory. And that's not to say that the theory doesn't have some advantages or applications when you want to talk about other groups. But in terms of black men, it's done an extremely narrow and insufficient job because it's defined them solely on power and the idea that they want to pursue patriarchy, not their vulnerability to depression, not their vulnerability to violence, not their vulnerability to rape, not their vulnerability to domestic abuse, etc. So we have to change the conversations. And, I said this before, we have to start studying black men with a kind of compassion that is not generally afforded to them throughout their lives. We have to care about what their suffering means. So the Man Not is trying to provide a theoretical lens for us to actually see what that suffering is and create concepts that theorize what it's most about.
Absolutely. Just want to shout out, and I hope I get your name right, Umo Wale Africa tweeted out, just catching his tweet right here. He just tweeted hashtag amplify Dr. Curry. So I'm gonna have to copy that hashtag and start using that when I'm sharing anything about Dr. Curry. But thanks so much for that hashtag. There's so much things I could cover, but here's an interesting comment in relation to the Man Not. it was early before our interview went live. I was tweeting out this interview. At Wicked Beauty said, if Black people want to grow as a community and as a people, we first must acknowledge the mistreatment of Black women, both past and present, which sort of is different than what you're saying.
Sure.
And you're mad on. What's your response to that?
I mean, there's not really a response. I mean, there's no contradiction between acknowledging the mistreatment of Black women and the study of Black men. I don't know. It's a tweet, so I don't know the context of it. But I would suggest that this individual, I don't know if it's a professor or a scholar, but she's correct that for Black people to move forward, we do have to acknowledge the pain and suffering of Black women and Black girls. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge the pain and suffering of Black men and Black boys that go beyond the idea that Black men and boys are only perpetrators, that Black men and boys are only violent. Because that's what we have today. Far too often, the conversations about the suffering and pain of Black women are reduced to Black men are bad or Black men are trash, and that's insufficient, right? It assumes that the cause of Black women's oppression is not the circumstances of a white supremacist society that is rampant with misogyny, that is rampant with sexism, but just the Black men that are in their neighborhoods. And that's what the Man Not is trying to challenge, is saying that, listen, if you view domestic violence as a major issue in the Black community, which it is, you can't look at one side of the domestic violence numbers. So you can't say that the lifetime prevalence for Black women, for example, when the CDC report is 6.6 million, and then ignore that 5.1 million Black men also suffer from domestic violence. You can't say that Black women are the most disproportionate and overlook the 12-month prevalence of 1.5 million Black men suffering per year as victims, right? You have to take both into account, and that's what doesn't happen. We assume that the early sexual experiences of Black men, which are statutory rape, we assume that the child abuse in our communities that are double the rates of whites has no effect. We have to assume that the neglect, the idea that Black teachers and Black mothers in our own communities believe that Black boys are less intelligent than Black girls and should be subject to more disciplinary measures. We can't overlook how these things socialize and affect Black men and then not give them any avenues or resources to deal with the trauma and disappointment of that reality. Now, that's not at odds with acknowledging Black women. That actually complements it. But it moves us outside of this Eurocentric Duluth model, which says that no woman has ever perpetrated violence against a man because of patriarchy, that no woman has beaten a child. And then when we do accept that there's child abuse in our communities, which are overwhelmingly perpetrated by women, Stacey Patton writes an excellent book on this, right? That we just ignore that fact because it doesn't fit with our politics. Understanding Black people and respecting the suffering of Black women means that we have to respect the environmental causes of that suffering, like poverty, like alcoholism, like depression, like having to take care of children in environments where work and resources are not plentiful, lack of access to health care, because those are the things that kill Black women the most since the birth of the 21st century. It's accidental deaths. It's cardiac arrest, it's diabetes, it's health problems. Homicide outside of the ages of 15 to 24 is actually pretty low, second, third, fourth, etc. So I would say that the sister's correct that we should, but I mean, I think that the context of what that means has to be scrutinized and interrogated much more. And on the side of Black men, just the things that I've mentioned, when do we have conversations about that?
Exactly.
I mean, I don't know of any, I know of no public discussion that talks to Black male survivors of domestic abuse or intimate partner homicide, right? I know of no shows that talk about the trauma of early sexual experience. Well, you have,
I have, but I'm not as big as I'd like to be, or I'm sure other people would like to. But we're getting there. But I fully agree with you. Those subjects, let alone in the general public, let alone in the Black environment, are taboo. Right. They are taboo. They don't. It's not supposed to be talked about. It's an assumed that we are strong, we are powerful. None of this stuff happens to us. And doing this over 10 years, I know it happens to a lot, but nothing is being said.
It does, and this is what I'm saying. So imagine the reality that most black boys lose their virginity before the ages of 14 in this country. What do you think? And this is often to older girls, older women, right? What do we think that does to a young black boy? Do we? I mean, like, is does the politics of gender or feminism really overwhelm our common sense in suggesting that there are a significant majority of young men whose first sexual experience is either coerced or statutory rape? And there are no treatment, there is no conversation, there is no literature that helps these young men interpret their experience. So what do you expect to happen when a 12 or 13-year-old boy, or in the case of one of our studies, a 9-year-old boy, has been raped by a woman for 5 or 6 years because it's just taken to be she's his rite of passage? And then when this young boy turns into a man and develops issues about his own self-image or about his ability to satisfy women or issues of abandonment, and we suddenly see a case of intimate partner violence, or we see a case of non-commit where he can't commit to one woman, or he has dangerous and promiscuous sex and has a child before the age of 21. Is that because of patriarchy, or is that because there's a trauma that has not been acknowledged, treated, and spoken about, so that he can actually have healthy relationships with other women, assuming that he's heterosexual, right?
And this is a good, I wanted to ask this conversation piece and what you just shared with us. The title, The Man Not.
Yes.
And I'm thinking this is a good time for you to share how you came up with the title after what you've just shared with us.
Mm-hmm.
Because many will think that we are men, but we're not fully men. And just before you answer that, I want to shout out to Yusuf Green, is saying Dr. Curry is spot on, and hello ADW. If you have any comments or questions for Dr. Curry, please share them. So I want to segue into how did the title come about, because that just popped in my mind what you've just shared about our manhood, not manhood.
Right. Yeah. So the title actually came to me. I guess it was like I was halfway asleep.
Okay. You sleep? You sleep? Amazing.
I do sleep. Yes, I do sleep. I'm a pretty active gamer sometimes too.
All right.
But, no, the title came to me, and I was halfway between waking up, and I was trying to think of a model. I was trying to think of a name that conveyed everything that I had learned about black males. And you have to understand that I didn't get to, it wasn't like there was another book about black men that I could pick up, and say, oh, wow, this has all the answers. Because when you look at any of the other texts, be Bell Hooks or Patricia Hill Collins or Kimberly Crenshaw or, Mark Anthony Neal, these texts start with a vastly ahistorical front of what black men were. For example, none of the work that I've included on ethnology in the 19th century, where you had white social scientists actually arguing that black men had evolved only to the level of a small female child, had ever been quoted, to my knowledge. Maybe St. Auburn quotes some of it, but in a mainstream book has never been quoted. Like, we've never discussed, the scales of evolution. We've never discussed that white ethnologists in the 19th century thought that when black men hit puberty, that they don't become men, they become rapists. And this was the dominant idea into the 1920s, and then in the 1930s, after E. Franklin Frazier published his book on the Negro family, black men became deserters and suffered from female personality disorders. So the whole history, the scientific account, and social proxemics of engaging black men have been formulated based on their deviance and their feminization as lesser men to white patriarchs. So once you read all that, I mean, the irony is that you have white women looking at black men as a way to base their own oppression off of. So when they were talking about women as a minority category or minority group, they were looking at, Negro men. And then you fast forward 30 years, and somehow black men went from, what Dorothy Height said in 1963, that one of the main concerns of elevating the black woman is to give the black man self-esteem, to 1978, 79, where black men suddenly became patriarchs. it's a nonsensical account of the historical, economic, and political development of black men. So the man not conveys that constant negation. Black men didn't wake up, contrary to the historiography we've all been given. Black men did not wake up out of slavery and say, "Wow, now we have rights. I'm going to be a man today." Because you had white women arguing that they were better patriarchs, more manlike and masculine than savage men. You see this all throughout Elizabeth Cady Stanton's The Revolution, when which was a magazine basically started to persuade Democrats and Republicans at the time not to vote for male enfranchisement. So you have black men referred to lower orders. You have black men referred to as having corrupt character. The idea that black men will lower the standard of civilization. This is what you're saying after black men died and gave their lives to end the Civil War, to end slavery. In the 20th century, you have the idea that black men are rapists, that black men can't be families, they can't be fathers, they can't have households. So then white social scientists say, hey, black men abuse their women. Black men are sexually aggressive and jealous, which is why Negroes fight all the time. You have accounts in the 1950s and 60s where black women are beating black men, like in Tally's Corner, because they're not man enough and can't provide for their household. Every single account of black males for the last century and a half has been based on the negation of the fact that they are men. Either they're effeminate, either they're rapists, or they suffer from female personality disorders, or they're not disciplined, or they're deviants, or they're deserters. These are the mainstream stereotypes we have of black males. And after the 80s, that simply transformed into black men being patriarchs, being abusers, and trying to dominate people. There has never been a positive conceptualization of black men outside of black nationalist or Pan-African movements in a way that's comparable to the disciplinary adoption of things like black feminism or gender studies or queer studies. So there has been a deliberate attempt to understudy black males, their particular vulnerabilities, their particular histories outside of sexuality studies in general. So while we may talk about figures, we don't know anything about black male psychology. While we'll talk about Du Bois or Fanon, we don't know anything about the development of the conditions of black men sexually within colonialism, which is exactly what Fanon is talking about. So the man not is meant to convey that perpetual negation as a starting place for what black men have been fighting to attain and what they've consistently been denied. And I think it's important because, as you can see in chapter 1, when you look at these black male burden societies, and when you look at what black men are actually saying about women, they simply do not imitate white patriarchy. They are not having arguments about taking their rightful place as the kings of the world to lead women forward. They're making arguments about the evolutionary trajectory of white patriarchy that demands things like colonialism and imperialism and genocide to sustain itself, and a notion of black manhood that is based in caring, democracy, and equality and egalitarianism, right? That is trying to challenge what white men and white women under the rubric of feminism are trying to spread the world over, which is their own culture, their own ethno-nationalism. So I argue that black men have fundamentally been misread.
Oh, well, I think that's an understatement. That's an understatement, but you add so much fact and context to it, and that's another great part of the book. A question here from Yusuf Green. He says, please excuse me, but I haven't bought the book yet, but it sounds like he's going to, and he's asking, does the book address the myth or misinformation of black men abandoning their homes and women?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What I show is that that's been a historical stereotype. I actually recently published an article on this very issue. The book argues that black men are in fact familial. That even when, and this is a very important finding that Dr. Siri McDougall has found, is that even when black men are absent from the home, other black men in the community take on the role as social fathers. And this confirms what Robert Staples said a long time ago in his book on black masculinity. And this is so important, contrary to the idea that black men simply abandon their wives and children, and that usually happens because of economic pressures. you find that other black men in the community take on the role of extended family. Said differently, the extended family network in black communities are not purely matriarchal, as we're often taught or assumed. They're also based in black men extending themselves as fathers and caretakers of children. An idea that is not vastly different than what Du Bois was doing with Augustus Dill, two black men, right? Augustus Dill was a gay black man who saw the need for racial advancement rooted in the cultivation and development of black children, which is why they created the Brownie books, which are child stories. What I show in the book is that this has always been a part of black men's ethos. It's always been a part of their political strategy. You see this again with the breakfast programs of the Black Panther Party. So you can look through centuries to see how black men have cared for children, how black men have extended themselves as fathers and caretakers, how black men have reformulated the basis of race consciousness in the Brownie books, how the Black Panthers wanted to educate and feed children in communities. And yet we don't associate any of these things with black manhood or maleness because we import Eurocentric definitions and stereotypes about black men, which only view them as pathological sex-hungry thugs. What I'm trying to do is offer the reader evidence that the way that we understand, see, and believe things about black males is not only false, but insidiously designed to demonize black men and boys to legitimize their extermination in the world. It assumes that black men are the dangers that have to be stamped out in their communities, not white supremacy. It's not poverty that causes abuse, which we know it actually does. It's black males. And once you could dehumanize black men in such a way that they become both the cause and effect of their own violence, it becomes very easy to say that the world would be better off without them. And what I'm trying to do is show that black men are integral parts of families, integral parts of communities, integral parts and pieces of history, and that we have to change how we think about that in relationship not only to how we engage young black men, but how we think about and conceptualize them under academic theory.
Excellent, 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 excellent stuff. There's so much in this book. One of the passages that really hit me is your discussion about the violence of poverty.
Oh, yeah.
Black males and the stigma, and I want to underline the word stigma of criminality. Whether you're a black man that's committed a crime or not, it's so apropos.
Yes, yes. I mean, when I was doing that, the research for that section, it was heartbreaking. You know, because I'm constantly reading books about black males. I mean, every day I'm like doing Google Scholar searches, you know, seeing if there's something I missed from some century, you know, in some decade in the early 1900s. Like, oh, here's a term I haven't thought about. But you know, when you look at how people thought about black males and what they go through, how they're systematically locked out of work and locked out of jobs and victims of poverty, where they literally become scavengers in this underclass or undercast more appropriately. Your heart has to bleed, because when you look at, you know, even Khalif Broder's story, you see a young man who came from a low socioeconomic position but had no criminal record, and was made into a criminal, was beaten and tortured and couldn't escape it.
But sad.
He was psychologically broken.
You know,
and it's not just him. That's the reason I included his story and the stories of so many other black men in the book, you know, as kind of a journalistic, you know, marker, is because it's not just him. There are hundreds, there are thousands of black men and boys that suffer from not being able to find work. And in order to eat, they have to turn to these other means that we think are less than respectable or criminal or deviant. But society locks them out of everything. And then when you look at the studies that show that even educated black men with no criminal records are perceived to have criminal records and are discriminated against on that basis, not only to other white employers, but also are preferred less than their black female counterparts, then what do you say or do? When you look at Robert Livingston's work that I cite in the book, and he says that black CEOs or managers literally trigger survival responses amongst whites. So they're never chosen, that they have to disarm white people. They have to crack jokes. We have to smile. We have to have baby faces that are clean cut and shaven so that white people don't become afraid of us. What are we doing? Right? What is the relationship that black men can have to work that does not send one into a schizophrenia or a severe depression? Because we're perceived as threats. We have the highest rates of unemployment in our culture, and people just ignore that. They just ignore the fact that black men literally fall out of the data after 6 months. They ignore how many of us are incarcerated, and they just chalk it up to some general theory of patriarchy when the evidence shows that there is so much suffering, that there is so much deprivation, there is so much poverty, there is so much homelessness and hopelessness amongst some young black men, not all, but some. Given the levels of discrimination in our society, why do we not care? And I think that was the biggest thing that moved me when I was writing the book, because I constantly said to my wife, how can we not care? How is it that it takes me writing this book and doing this research where no one, and I've taken gender studies classes. I was getting a master's certificate in gender studies at DePaul, and I've never had these conversations about black males or brown males or Jewish males, any of the things that I actually study right now. So there's an indifference, right, to the suffering of racialized men, and I'll be fair, even poor white men. I mean, they're not my favorite group to study for obvious reasons, but at the same time, when you look at their health markers, they have very similar characteristics in terms of life expectancy, the types of work they do, disease, sickness, etc., that other racialized groups of men do, right? And there's no engagement with that fact. There is only the disavowal of male suffering because they're men. And for the life of me, given that I do all the intellectual history around the development of patriarchy and development of the modal white family in the 19th century, I'm confused because none of the evidence says that. If I can say it differently, there was no argument that black men were patriarchs in any of the white social science literature or any of the literature that you have from black female socialists before the 1970s or 80s. You have arguments about paternalism, you have arguments about chauvinism, you have certain mentions of things like sexism, but you don't have the argument that black men are fundamentally rooted culturally, psychologically, and politically in the system of patriarchy until after the 1980s. And that's a profound statement because it means that period of time really did color and determine how we read black men in this century, in the 21st century. And there's been no challenge to it, right? There's not even a discussion about it. It's either you accept it or you're a bad person. And I have a hard time accepting things people tell me. So I went and read about it, and it's just not the case. This is the funny part. White men and white women both asserted they were more patriarchal and masculine than black men because black men were savages. Like the whole argument for why white people were able to break themselves up into genders and, do the white man and the white woman's burden was because they were like, we're white people. We're the only civilized race in the world. And that wasn't something that was, ancient. They were articulating this argument well into the 1940s and 50s when they were justifying segregation in the South. So how do we go from everyone in the world believing that black men could not be patriarchs to a time frame between the 60s and I guess the 80s where we have full-blown black male patriarchy and the only thing they want to do is imitate white men? Think about that. The people who lynched them, the people who committed castration against them. And that's the important part of the book. The debate at the turn of the century was to stop rape was about lynching black men or castrating black men. These were your two castration was the progressive option. That's right.
Wow.
So no, I mean I'm serious. Like this is how these ethnologists and sexologists talk, right? So if this is what we're dealing with, how do we say that black men want to imitate the people who did this to them? The men who raped them, the women who raped them. So whereas black women are victims of rape and brutality and their children being taken away. And this made black women form a unique consciousness that understood sexual violence. Black men have their wives, children, they're castrated, they're lynched, they're boiled and eaten, they've been drunk as elixirs, they've been anally sodomized, they've been systematically denied access to the workforce, and then on top of all that, they're called the rapists, so you don't even have any sympathy or empathy with their condition. And out of all that, right, black men have not formed any other strategy of dealing with oppression except wanting to be like white men. This is what we're taught in schools. So even white women have a revolutionary consciousness on the basis of their gender. And I mean, I don't want to get started on all the issues I have with white feminism, but
you can if you want. You got this in part two. It's well, you know what, and it is interesting because it has come up on my epic conversations from a number of black men saying this is what they say, the biggest beneficiary of what's the word? Oh, I went blank for a second.
Affirmative action?
Yes, affirmative action have been white women, and
that's true.
And it's interesting because I just put a post from an article on HuffPost saying that it wasn't just white men protesting in Charlottesville.
No. But I mean, this is the research that I do, right? I mean, this is why I'm constantly telling people that the arguments we have about gender and about white women's exclusion from it, like this is the end of chapter 1, is largely false. White women participated in the Klan. White women raped people. White women killed black men. White women, as in like in the case of Willie McGee, falsely accused black men of rape to hide that they were having affairs or raping black men. This is all part of history. This happened. Ida B. Wells talks about this, about white women pursuing black store clerks. And if black men finally gave in to them because they didn't want to be accused of rape, when people found out, they were killed and accused of rape. Like it's the inevitably, black men are considered to be and have historically been punished as the rapists, even when they were victims of rape themselves. So there is nothing that we can do to get around that fact. And for us to talk about white women's vulnerability to sexuality without contextualizing the history of rape, the history of castration, the history of lynching, the history of genital mutilation of men, that's accounted for in all these stories of settlers going to Africa or Southeast Asia, etc., is just intellectually dishonest. Most people look at the question of gender as an identity politic. And I'm arguing that we need to actually do a material and empirical study of what happened to certain bodies. This is not an argument about black men should reclaim their true masculinity by being straight, because I don't even know what that means given the research I do. Right? Because throughout history, you've always been effeminate. If a white man wants to have sex with you, whether or not you're straight or gay, a white man has the power to make you into whatever he or she wants, or a white man, whatever he wants. If a white woman says, if you don't sleep with me, I'm going to call rape, she has the power to make you into a rapist. Right? So what I don't understand, given that history, why we're arguing about ideal subjects and types, when none of this theory matters given the empirical realities that we have before us. And we're demonizing each other. We're condemning each other, and it always ends up being black men, despite the studies that show that homophobic attitudes in the black community are pretty similar. Albeit black women are more progressive, and it changes with education and social mobility, etc., because they're the more educated group. Initially, in terms of religion and class dynamics, black men and women have pretty much the same views on gender and sexuality. It's a question of environment and context. But then we talk about black men, and black men are the only sexists. They're the only misogynists. They're the only homophobes in our community. And this is not true, because it places the blame on some decadent or erroneous or erratic black masculinity, when the issue is the environment, the religion, the poverty, the class, the exposure, etc. That dictates every other group's disposition towards these views. Right?
Absolutely. Dr. Curry, I'm going to ask a promise that you come back sooner rather than later, within a week or so, because I just got I have some good news for you.
What's that?
At son_of_Malcolm just tweeted out, I just bought the book off this interview.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
So definitely people want you back. And also shout out to Hermezi, who favorited the tweet. So you're gonna have to come back real quick because people loving this.
No, absolutely. I'll be happy.
And I know, folks, we're not getting to the man not, but it's a general conversation. I'm pulling some stuff from the man not, but also their comments coming in. Again, AD space W, he says he's interested in Dr. Curry's opinion on black feminism. And how does it come up in the man not?
Oh, I could look. I am critical of black feminism, because I think that it takes a very small moment of black women's activism and then reads it backwards. So the book talks, for instance, about Anna Julia Cooper and some of the women of the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory. And I say, listen, if we compare their views on gender to, say, the views of Du Bois or Alexander Crummell or Edward Blyden, we don't see that many distinctions. So why do we assume that gender as a construct is transhistorical, that it doesn't change through the centuries? Because that's not true. And what we do with making that assertion is we measure black men based on the feminist politics of today. So if black men didn't include black women in certain social groups, that was sexist. But the only group we look at is the American Negro Academy. We don't look at the Negro Society for Historical Research. We don't look at the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, which all have black women, giving papers and being published and having and debating policies. So the question is, why do we keep short-handing black history and the complexities of black history from one narrative? So if you can point to the A&A, why can't I point to the Atlanta Sociological Lab? Du Bois was in both. He was prominent in both. Why, if we're going to talk about black women not producing scholarship or making some of the arguments that Hazel Carby's making, that black women weren't viewed as intellectuals, well, let's test that. Did Du Bois publish black women? Did the Negro Society of Historical Research publish black women? Of course they did. So then that's a counterexample to how many black feminists talk about black men and their participation. The other problem is that becomes the only standard. So you assume that even though someone like Anna Julia Cooper supported imperialism and a kind of Christian fiefdom of the world, that becomes the measure of progressiveness. That's a bad thing. Imperialism and trying to stamp out Islam are hoping that other inferior cultures who weren't Christian are taken over by the providence of God is a bad thing. We should not agree with that just because it's Anna Julia Cooper who has become the symbol of black feminism. We should be critical of the different aspects that, say, she supported that are not good for the world, like Islamophobia, and why people like Edward Blyden or Du Bois had vastly different views. We can't pick and choose, and I think that what black feminism does as an academic discipline is it picks and chooses the kinds of incidents it wants to talk about. It'll pick and choose, Ray Rice beating his wife, but it'll ignore all the homicides or bidirectional violence where black women have shot black men or where black women are abusing black children. I'm arguing that intersectionality or black feminism, whatever you want to call it, has to deal with the kind of empirical facts around black male life. And yes, that means that some black feminist theories are wrong. That doesn't mean that black feminism is fundamentally wrong or immoral. It just means that there are some theories that have not been tested, that have been imported, like the Duluth model, the idea that black men abuse for power, that are not based on any actual studies or facts of black men. And when we look at those facts, when we look at black males' experience, when we look at the trauma and the cycles of violence that happens in these communities, houses, and neighborhoods, you cannot persuasively exclude black women from participating in that. So I think that black feminism has to be challenged. And I think that some of the arguments that are taken as mainstream theory of black feminism about black masculinity are not only false, but they're heavily misandric in the sense that they use racial stereotypes about black men's hyper personalities, be it hypersexuality, hypermasculinity, to define what black men are. And that's an inappropriate and pathological reading of black male subjects. Excellent. It's popular, but it's ultimately wrong because it can't be verified anywhere else. So I guess my views of many of the ideas that come out of black feminism, specifically about black men, is that they're anti-empirical and I think that they're historically inaccurate, right? Because they're picking up some trajectories from white social science that I think black men and black male studies have to fundamentally engage in question. And I think the other side of this too is that some of the ideas about intersectionality and black feminism become so malleable, right? That, like when I was doing research for this article, I read all of Kimberly Crenshaw's work. I've read it before, largely because I do critical race theory. But, I read all this work and I read all of Patricia Hill Collins. And you see these definitions constantly changing, right? Darren Hutchison and Athena Matua have made comments on this. It's like, you criticize the theory doesn't respond, and it's like, oh, now this is the new theory. It just incorporates the criticism, right? And I think that in the case of black men, there's a larger question to be asked, which is, why have we not seen any positive or not non-deficit models, meaning that black men are lacking manhood, hence want power, or black men are abusers, be produced by intersectionality theorists over the last 30 years? And to me, that's an empirical question. Like, if you're looking at, Frank Cooper's work, if you're looking at, Devin Carbato's more nuanced, but he still holds, some views of black masculinity that have not been tested. Some of these ideas about black men being toxic or hegemonic masculinity, that's not Connell's work. Connell doesn't believe ethnic minorities or ethnic men are in fact hegemonic because they're oppressed by colonialism and fall outside of the ruling class. That doesn't mean they can't be violent. That doesn't mean they can't be sexist. It just means that's not the term that even Connell uses to designate the history or the suffering or lives of poor racial men. So I have questions. Why are these things imported? There's no explanation. We don't have practically any gender theories that are dealing with Connell's work, or even her decision to focus now on masculinities in the global South. We don't have any works that are looking at some of Adam Jones's work or some of the work in genocide studies that talk about subjugated or subordinate men being the most disposable and expendable, even in low-level warfare or genocide. One of the big things that I constantly get pushback for in my field, they keep calling hotepery, even though the theory is developed by an endowed professor at Harvard in psychology, is some of the issues around social dominance theory. Why are we not talking about this? Those right there are three different theories that all come to vastly different conclusions about the positionality that black men have, or racialized or subordinate men have, within patriarchal societies. And they've been around for decades. And none of these have made it into our conversations. And I want to know why. I want to know why black feminism or intersectionality becomes the dominant view of studying black men when there are theories by other men, two of which are by men of color, that have no resonance whatsoever in how we study these subjects, despite these theories being overwhelmingly endorsed in the social sciences, right? Because all they do is test things. So yeah, I think that anytime somebody criticizes black feminism, you're going to be met with the ad hominem attacks of your misogynist, your sexist, etc. I've heard, God knows, there's like a new one every day. That I hear on somebody's Facebook or post. But I think that the job of the intellectual is to follow evidence. And I'm raising serious questions about black feminism that perhaps will push their theorizations, even farther. In terms of how they see the empirical aspects of standpoint epistemology or intersectionality. But if this just becomes an argument that black men don't have a right to speak on gender or don't have a right to speak about sexuality, then I'm going to adamantly resist and reject that, which is why I wrote the book. Because it shows that black men have experiences that have not been considered under black feminism. There have been cases and activism that has not been taken account of in black feminist historiography, which is why I just think that black men, that other racialized men, need a separate field of black male studies to study what subordinate male status or racially subjugated masculinity looks like. Really quickly, when I went to the Shoah Foundation in January, I discovered, and this is largely just because I was messing around in their visual archives and listening to stories. I was just curious if Jewish men had been raped during the Holocaust. And when I found 41 stories or 42 testimonies where you see this kind of issue going on. So if Jewish men are being raped, I found 3 cases where Armenian men are being raped. I know that black men were being raped. And I'm pretty sure I'm doing, now my next goal is to look at like Japanese internment in the United States and see if there was any sexual violence there. So I know factually, right, that all this happened. So then what does that tell me about racial subjugation and racialized males within patriarchal or repressive racial regimes? There seems to be a pattern that in every situation, because all these men are stereotyped as being rapists, in every situation of racial subjugation, you both have the phenomena of the rapist and the subjugation or victimization of racialized men as being victims or subject to rape by the dominant group, men or women. Where have we explored that reality?
Good,
Like, this is
very
a
good
new
question.
research question,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. I'm got some more, and folks are going to be start winding it down soon, but there is going to be a part two, guarantee within the next 7 to 10 days. But also, just following up here, comments are flying in. Yusuf and AD Space W agree 100% with what you're saying. But there's also maintain in K has a question here saying, have any contemporary scholars been critical of the man not? And if they have been, what have their criticisms been?
The only I haven't had anyone be critical of the actual research. Most of it's been based on the identity politic that I'm talking about and centering black men. So again, I think that's where you get the kinds of conversations about, oh well, black feminists have already done this project, and I think anybody who reads the book can see that that's not the case at all. Or that it's anti-woman because it centers black men, things of that sort. But I've heard no actual engagements with the scholarship portion of it. I think that because the academy is so heavily based in identity politics, that's been the major challenge. That, well, you're centering black men, and I just say yes. I was like, that's the title of the book. It's a book on black manhood. So I'm interested in homoeroticism. I'm interested about rape. I'm interested in sexual violence. I'm interested in the death and dying. And that's why I call it dying, because I feel that given the conditions that black males are in, that they don't have a positive notion of life. It's just the persistence of dying through the various dehumanization and the negations that they suffer under in American society. So yeah, I mean that's the best I have for you right now. The book is still pretty new, so I'm sure as it becomes more popular and people are reading it more, there are going to be challenges to it. And I'm well prepared for that. I wrote the book in such a way that I think the evidence is just a lot of scholarship. There's a lot of stuff we have to read if we're going to criticize it. But I'm prepared for those debates because I'm constantly reading. I'm constantly finding new literatures and new connections. So I think that the challenges about the man not would be good, and I think that it's good for black scholars to move beyond dogma. And even if the man not inevitably, fails and people disprove it or whatever the case may be, I don't think that'll happen. But let's say that it does. It's a conversation and a moment in black intellectual growth and black gender studies and political theory that should be had, where at least we know to refute the book, there has to be some empirical validation or verification of what we think about black males. And hopefully, even if it is the case that black men have toxic masculinities, etc., then we get answers that are beyond adopt feminist politics, and we talk about things like mental health and employment and trauma treatment and conflict resolution in our communities. I'm not big into this idea that you solve every problem by adopting my politics. That seems to me very similar to the idea that if you want to go to heaven, adopt my religion. We're supposed to be thinkers, and we have an obligation and duty to investigate the lives of black people if we claim that we're studying race, or we claim that we're race scholars or race theorists. And insofar as we substitute study for morality and dogma, we have failed at that project. And that's what I'm trying to prevent. I'm trying to prevent us from falling into a idea of young black men and boys that makes them synonymous with evil, rather than see their humanity and see how they're victims of their environment and sociological condition, not their ontological disposition.
Excellent. Just some other comments here. Maintaining. Kate says, thanks, Dr. Vibe and Dr. Curry. He says, the book is great, by the way. And also, Yusuf Green is saying, I've been telling everyone about the book and sharing many YouTube interviews with Dr. Curry, and says he's buying the book tonight. And I'm just in the chat area. If you want to buy the book, the link is in the chat area. You just click on it. You can buy it at Amazon. I don't know if I should go on for another conversation piece or hold off to part two. What are you feeling, Dr. Curry?
I got a few more minutes. We could do one more.
Okay. From the book, The Political Economy of Niggerdom.
Yes.
Racist misandry, class warfare, and the disciplinary propagation of super predator mythology. Heavy topics, but real topics. And you bring up a case about Lil B.
Yes.
Can you just give a little overview on Lil B and how it relates to the political economy of niggerdom?
Well, first, The Condemnation of Little B was a book written by Elaine Brown, and I thought that it was a profound reading of the class dynamics involved in the dismissal and disavowal of poor black men in this country. And I say that because in the academy, there is a way of writing about black people that is endorsed by black scholars that seek to maintain distance between the black scholar that's conducting the study and the problem people that are studying. So nobody wants to be the poor black man in America, but people have a lot of opinions about poor black men in America. And what Elaine Brown created and what she did in that book is to give an account of the various political economics, the kinds of values, stereotypes, and ideologies that were driving market decisions in a very specific neoliberal way. I remember once I was having a conversation with a black feminist scholar, and I told her that one of the ways that we should understand the disposition that black academics have to black men is not as rational, but as neoliberal. I was like, the idea of a homo economicus, the idea of a economic human being, is vastly important, because we can see that the decisions of how we write and speak about black males in theory are driven by market forces and consent. That if you write about black men as being patriarchal, abusive, etc., there is a already made audience for that kind of language. There's no need for citation. There's no need for evidence. There's no need for ethnography, because we all know through our stereotypes that that's true. So then what does it mean when black scholars engage and participate in this kind of academic market that says we want to claim that we study race, but we've already predetermined that poor black men are a social problem, that poor black men are abusers and rapists, that poor black men are dangerous to children and women? How does that advance the cause of study? Because it's already a predetermined theory of what you've decided this group is. So then how does this fit into the theories that are produced about black males? And that's why that chapter goes so much into the issue of work and poverty and domestic abuse and the stigmas of rape and foster care. Because what it tries to show is that the decisions are the idea of anti-black misandry, which is defined in chapter 5. These things are driven not just about some abstract hope or hate or stereotype of black males, but by the way that people profit from the politics associated with the demonization of black men, both black and white. See, when we talk about the prison industrial complex, we're quick to say that white capitalists are taking advantage of poor black men, their labor, and their lives. But then when the academic in the academic industrial complex writes about black men as abusers and as the terrors that white people imagine, we pretend that there's no benefit or currency from doing so. And what that chapter is trying to show, and Elaine Brown does a great job with this, you also see other people throughout the book making very similar arguments, that there is an academic managerial class that utilizes the notion of black masculinity as the wager between white liberals and gender politics. Said differently, if there's going to be a conversation about specialization, an easy way to co-sign to feminist politics and liberal white agendas is to problematize racial masculinity. So whereas we would call white people out, white liberals in the academy out for saying something like black men are rapists, black men are criminals because they are black, we accept that proposition to the white liberal and we say, because black men are hypermasculine and want to imitate the laws of patriarchy, they rape and abuse women. The same proposition can simply be turned, the same claim rather, can rather be accepted if we simply change the terms of the proposition. And this means that you can still have insidious racial stereotypes that lend legitimacy to well-established racial theories and social sciences, simply by making racial claims into gender claims. And that means that there's going to be a gap in distance between how the black scholar interprets the social reality and then what they interpret and write about, how they present that so that it appeals to the white liberal audience that overwhelmingly comprise the U.S. Academy. So that's why I talk about it as the political economics of niggerdom. Because this is not just about the profit motive, but the kinds of values that are created in the exchange between profit interpretation, profit culture, profit and intellectualization and theory that have created this problem of how we view black men and boys.
Wow. Wow. I'm going to ask another quick little Dr. Curry thought process. What would the man not say about what happened last weekend in Charlottesville?
Well, I think if you look at the antecedents to this, it's the man not is very relevant. Because remember, when you're talking about people like Dylan Roof, when you're talking about the white guy who, I think it was in Brooklyn, where he said he was coming to murder black men for being rapists, where he just started stabbing black men on the street. When you look at these kinds of fears, what you see, and it's not just black men, but you see a kind of phobia and heightened paranoia around the sexuality of racialized men. And, you know, I've told people in my field this before, I've said this in other interviews. I was like, when Donald Trump was making the claim that Mexicans are rapists and that Muslims would come in and, you know, change the culture of their people and marry their daughters, their Christian white daughters, what they are saying is that white endogamy, the ability of white people to biologically and culturally reproduce, is being threatened. That's why Dylan Roof said that black men were raping their women. That's why the guy in Brooklyn said, I'm going to start killing black men. So what you see in Charlottesville is the accumulation of white people, not just white men, but white men and white women, fearing that they will be outproduced and that they will be culturally displaced in the inevitable minoritization of the white race. And whereas they tell black, brown people, Muslims, and immigrants that America is a great land of opportunity and equality, where their minority status does not affect them, white people have now said and built movements around the fact that their white people becoming minorities is the greatest tragedy and tyranny that's ever happened in the history of civilization. So the man not would say that if we're looking at this, we can see the anxiety and the phobias produced around the sexuality and reproduction of racialized bodies that white people see as being driven by racialized men, be they Mexican, Muslim, or black. And that everything that Trump has done has been an attempt to slow immigration, to exclude Mexican and deport Mexican or Hispanic or Latino males, and to incarcerate and allow the slow extermination of black men, so that the destruction of these men, the limiting of their movement, the segregation or the proximity by which they can operate in, now become the basis of controlling and propagating white racial superiority. He's worried about the birth rate of white people, said simply. And that's why these white people were chanting, "You will not replace us." Because they are fearful of the idea that white people will become minorities and that they will have less white bodies to dictate the power dynamics of America's so-called democracy.
Well, I think we're going to end it right there. I'll just put a little add-on. Last night I had a gentleman on, Dewan Hopewell, and he was quoting some studies saying for the first time in history, there are studies showing that the life expectancy of black men is going up, while the life expectancy of white men is going down.
Down, yes, yeah. I think we
So
gained like a half a year or something.
yeah, so it's just
Yeah.
very interesting. So that interesting fact added on to what Dr. Curry had to share. One last comment here from Maintaining K says a type of racialized androphobia is what
Yeah.
Dr. Curry is talking about. Wow,
Yeah.
this has
which is
yeah,
that's exactly it. It would be, that's why we call it racist misandry. Right?
exactly. Well,
This is a fear of men.
that is it. I think Dr. Curry has given everything and more tonight. I'm going to shout out some people who did some great tweeting and retweeting. Shell B, Hermezy, Nation State of Mind, Anti-Negro Saxon. Thank you for your tweets. I also want to thank AD Space W, also Yusuf Green, Maintaining K. Thank you so much. I know that 1 and 2 you have bought the book. Dr. Curry really appreciates that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the support.
Absolutely. And before we sign off, if you look in the chat section, you can click on the link to buy the book. I will also put the link for you to buy the book on the replay of this epic conversation. Dr. Curry, where can people touch base with you?
So they could try to follow me on Twitter at DRTJC. They can certainly email me at tjcurry@tamu.edu. I'll be happy to correspond and speak to anyone on those two venues.
Excellent. I didn't get the email address, but I'm going to put his Twitter handle there. And what was the email address again, Dr. Curry?
tjcurry
Yeah.
at tamu.edu.
Yes. There it is in the comment section, contact information. So Dr. Curry, after we're finished, we're going to be offline. I'm going to get a commitment on when he's going to come back, and it will be in the next
Absolutely.
week because we just scratched the surface. But what I'm really happy about is that, Yusuf Green just bought the book. There you go.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
And this is what we're here for him to shine, but also to get important thought process and context into your heads and your hearts.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if any other of the conversations that Dr. Curry is on where people bought the book in real time.
Right. Well, I'm thankful, and this is what I said. The book, I wrote the book for black men because I felt that black men needed a way to understand themselves beyond the way we speak about them now. But the book has in mind the black community.
Yes.
And I think that anyone who reads the book can see that it does not approach the problem of black men from the degradation of black women. It does not take a stance that says that black heterosexuality is right and black homosexuality is wrong. This is not that kind of book. This book is trying to get black people to understand where black men and boys are and what we have so woefully misunderstood about their suffering, so that we can improve not only their lives but their participation in the life world of the black community overall.
Wonderful. We'll sign it off there, folks. It is Dr. Vibe, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show. I'm the host of Epic Conversations, as you can tell. And the Dr. Vibe Show is the home of Epic Conversations. If you want to touch base with me, you can follow me on Twitter at DRVIBESHOW. Email address dr.vibe at the.drvibeshow.com. Certainly you can go to the website address www.drvibeshow.com. If you want to catch replays of conversations like this, video-wise, go to my YouTube channel. 220, 30 subscribers in the last few months. Thank you so much. If you feel like it, certainly subscribe to the channel because we have epic conversations going back many years. You can even go through and see Dr. Curry's first appearance on the Dr. Vibe Show many years ago. So you can just get more, because I'm going to say that I'm the only online video platform has done more of these with Dr. Curry than anybody else. I think I'm pretty sure that I'm the only one. So if you want to catch more of Dr. Curry, go to the website or go to my YouTube channel. Also, I'm a certified empowerment coach, president and CEO of Express Your Vibe Coaching and Communications. If you'd like a complimentary empowerment session, 30-minute, check me out. Also, if you want to catch, tell Dr. Curry 1979 was a hell of a year. LOL. I don't know what's meant by that, but there must be something. Okay, I'll leave it at that. All right, and if you want to catch replays of my audio epic conversations, go to the website. You can also go to Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher Radio, Google Play Music Store, Selective Conversations on thegoodmanproject.com. If I get permission from Laurent Barton, I'll be able to post this, and also I can put it on WJMS Radio. As always, I'd like to say you're blessed and highly favored. You're a magnet for miracles and your solution for someone's problem. I'd like to thank everyone, especially everyone who watched us live tonight. Appreciate it, not taken for granted. Please follow me on Twitter. Would like to keep the conversation going. Live your life as a dream. And if you can dream it, you can make it. And finally, sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. And one last thing. This is one of the few books that has impacted me as a black man. And it puts me in the same sort of mindset that many, many years ago I read a book called Black Men, Obsolete, Single, and Dangerous. If you don't, first buy Dr. Curry's book, but also if you can find that book, that is a landmark book. That book changed my life as a black man, as this book has changed my life as a black man. God bless. Peace to you all. Keep the faith. We'll see Dr. Curry within the next 7 days and hope you're back. Good night.